Following the outbreak of the Second Punic War in 219 BC, the Romans sent an army under Publius Cornelius Scipio towards Iberia. Rather than waiting for the Romans in Spain, Hannibal Barca set off on a dangerous journey towards Italy that would lead him over the Alps. The two armies crossed paths in southern Gaul, but Hannibal decided to press forth, ignoring the Roman threat. Publius sent his older brother, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, to Spain with the bulk of the forces, while he returned to Italy to personally organize the defenses. While Hannibal was winning victories in Italy, Gnaeus successfully secured northern Iberia, reaching the Ebro River. Encouraged by his victories, the Senate sent over his brother Publius with some reinforcements in 217. With their combined armies, the two brothers advanced further south, expanding Roman territory all the way to Saguntum. Their victories made them overconfident, and in 211 they launched a new offensive, marching deep inside the Punic territory. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered in the battles of Upper Baetis, both brothers were killed and most of their forces destroyed. With them, the web of alliances with Spanish chieftains was shattered. Claudius Nero was sent to hold what little territory the Romans had in the north, but he was soon recalled to Italy. With an imminent defeat looming in the region, no one dared to take up the command, leaving the door open for arguably the greatest of all Roman generals. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus was born in 235 BC. Although he would earn his cognomen Africanus only later in life after defeating Hannibal, we will use it throughout the series to more easily distinguish him from the rest of his family. Publius was first mentioned in the historical record in 218 BC when his father, also named Publius, was elected consul and sent against Hannibal. Young Publius, who was 17 at the time, accompanied his father, having been appointed to his cavalry escort. In the first battle of the war, the Battle of Ticinus, Africanus rode alone into the front line to save his wounded father. Some of his critics would claim this feat was performed by a Ligurian slave and later appropriated by the fame-hungry Scipio. However, it is unlikely that the slave would be armed and on horseback in the midst of a battle. During the following disaster at Trebia, Publius likely stayed back at the camp with his wounded father. With the elder Publius sent off to Spain in 217, Africanus was likely not present for the second disaster at Lake Trasimene. He would, however, follow his father-in-law, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, to Cannae as one of the military tribunes of the Second Legion. Young men had to serve at least 5 years in the army before being appointed as military tribunes. But as we shall soon see, the Romans were quick to bend the rules in times of crisis. As we have previously discussed, the Battle of Cannae is one of the greatest disasters in Roman military history. Upwards of 50,000 Romans, including Paulus and other lesser commanders, perished on that day. Only a small group of infantrymen managed to break through and escape to the surrounding countryside. Among these was, of course, Scipio Africanus. He and other tribunes managed to gather the survivors at Canusium. There, he overheard some wealthy young men planning an escape out of Italy. Drawing up his sword, Scipio made them swear an oath not to abandon the Republic in its greatest hour of need. The second consul Vero then arrived at Canusium and took control of what remained of the once great army. These disasters must have played a crucial part in shaping young Scipio's views on military tactics. While the Roman armies were collapsing around him, he would learn from Rome's greatest adversary, eventually even surpassing him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The details of his career after Cannae are shrouded in mystery. He likely served in Italy, or possibly in Sicily, alongside other survivors from Cannae. In 213 BC, he was elected a curule aedile. The tribune of the plebs protested his appointment, as he had not yet reached the required age to hold this office. However, due to overwhelming support from the voting assembly, the tribune stepped down, allowing Scipio to hold the office. Only 22 at the time, Scipio proclaimed, "If all the citizens wish to make me aedile, I am old enough." As a curule aedile, he spent large amounts of money on festival games in honor of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. This made the aspiring politician even more popular within the city. In 211, the news of the deaths of Publius and Gnaeus Scipio reached Italy. The news shocked not only the young Publius, but the whole of Rome. Their most successful theater of war was devastated, and their control of Iberia was shattered. The fears of Hasdrubal Barca following in his brother's footsteps and crossing the Alps weighed heavily on every Roman. Gaius Claudius Nero was sent to organize the remnants of the Scipio forces, but he was recalled to Rome in 210. Seeing no hope for glory in the far west, none of the Roman generals put forth their names for the command of the region. To the astonishment of the crowd gathered on the Campus Martius, young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the late Publius, announced his candidacy. He was only 25 at the time. With the memory of his father still fresh in everyone's mind and his popularity at a high, Scipio was unanimously elected. As we have already seen, the Romans would bend some rules when the need arose, but this move was entirely unprecedented. To explain why, we will need to take a moment to examine the Roman cursus honorum, or the political ladder of ancient Rome. There were numerous political offices in Rome, but we'll only focus on those relevant here. The lowest rank in the cursus honorum was the military tribune. These were officers in the Roman army, and each legion was assigned 6 tribunes. As we have already mentioned, the men had to serve at least 5 years in the military before being eligible for the office. Although not strictly required for moving up the political ladder, most ambitious men served as military tribunes to bolster their political careers. This would be changed by Sulla's reforms when the office became mandatory. Scipio was appointed to the office at the age of 19 after serving only a year or 2 in the military. The next step on the cursus honorum was the quaestor. Quaestors supervised the treasury, audited funds, and collected taxes. When assigned to a consular army, they were responsible for managing finances and dividing the spoils of war. All elected quaestors were appointed to the Senate. Publius skipped this step, never serving as a quaestor in his career. The next office was the optional curule aedile. They, along with the plebeian aediles, were responsible for the upkeep of the city of Rome, supervising public works, and organizing games and festivals. To be eligible for the office, one had to previously serve as a quaestor. Scipio was elected aedile when he was just 22, without meeting the previous requirement. Above the aediles were the praetors, and finally the consuls. Praetors and consuls were the only offices that held imperium, or the power to rule. As such, only they could command the Roman army. Later in life, Publius would be elected consul, but for now he was merely a private citizen. He never held imperium, and although eligible, he was not yet appointed to the Senate. For the first time in the history of the Republic, a young man barely entering the cursus honorum was suddenly appointed a proconsul and granted imperium, thus bypassing all established laws and customs. With no command experience to speak of, Scipio would take over one of the most important theaters of the war. His close childhood friend, Publius Licinius Crassus, serving as Pontifex Maximus, saw no problem with Scipio's appointment. Although the young Publius had his critics in the Senate, they chose to remain silent, as one of the greatest gambles in the history of the Republic was unfolding before their eyes. Having made all the necessary preparations, Scipio sailed to Iberia with 10,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. He chose Marcus Junius Silanus to accompany him. Silanus was an older man with experience, having served as praetor in 212 BC. Scipio was also accompanied by his close friend Gaius Laelius, who would serve as his second-in-command. The situation in Spain was not as dire as was feared in Rome. The remnants of the Roman army were well organized, and some coastal allies remained loyal. Meanwhile, the 3 generals, Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisco, who had united to defeat the Scipiones the previous year, had now fallen out. Mago headed southwest to Algarve, Hasdrubal was north of the Tagus, fighting the Carpetani, and Gisco was in the far west near the mouth of the Tagus. All of them were more than 10 days' march from the capital of Punic Spain, Carthago Nova. Scipio spent the rest of 210 gathering intelligence on his adversaries and preparing the army for the upcoming campaigning season. Learning the location of the Carthaginian generals, Publius chose a daring course of action. Unlike his father, who slowly marched south, capturing strongholds and securing allies, Africanus decided to march directly on Carthago Nova. Secrecy was the key to his success, and he only shared his plans with Laelius. Thus, in early 209, Scipio set off with 25,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. Silanus was left at the Ebro with 3,500 troops. Laelius commanded a squadron of 35 quinqueremes that accompanied the marching army. According to our sources, Scipio crossed this great distance in just 7 days. Carthago Nova was situated on a small peninsula, accessible only from the narrow isthmus on the eastern side. On its southern side stood one of the best natural harbors in Spain. North of the city was a shallow lagoon connected to the sea by a man-made canal. Although it had strong natural defenses, the city was poorly manned. The garrison commander, another Mago, had only 1,000 mercenaries along with some 2,000 armed townsfolk. When the Romans arrived near the city, Scipio gave a rousing speech to his men. He told them Neptune had revealed the plan to him in a dream and promised great rewards for the first man to scale the walls. Speed was now of the utmost essence, and without allowing the men to rest, Scipio soon launched an attack on the city. The outnumbered Carthaginians made a desperate sortie, but they were easily repelled. Failing to follow the fleeing troops through the gates, Scipio sent ladders to scale the walls. Laelius and the fleet lined up beneath the walls and showered the defenders with missiles. Making no headway, Scipio sounded a retreat and the men returned to the camp. It was customary to allow troops several days' rest after such an assault. However, Scipio sent 500 carefully chosen men to the far side of the lagoon. The fishermen he questioned during the winter told him that in the afternoons the water in the lagoon receded enough for men to cross on foot. To the surprise of the exhausted defenders, Scipio launched another, even fiercer attack. Mago, lacking the troops to defend the entire city, concentrated his forces on the eastern and southern sides. This left part of the northern wall undefended. The special force seized this opportunity and scaled the walls. Encountering only limited resistance, they rushed east and opened the city gates. Seeing the men cross the water successfully, the Romans believed Neptune was aiding them in the assault, and they pushed on with great resolve. The defenses were finally broken, and the looting of the city began. Scipio took 1,000 of his men and encircled Mago in the citadel. Once the commander surrendered, Scipio ordered a stop to the plundering. There are some issues with this narrative, notably the crossing of the lagoon. The outflow that would significantly lower the water level is difficult to explain. It's also unlikely that the men carrying ladders could march around the lagoon and cross it without being noticed by the defenders on the walls. It's more likely that the men rushed along the southern shore of the lagoon and found an unguarded section of the wall. Whatever the case may be, Scipio scored the first of his many spectacular victories. It was now time to divide the spoils. Large amounts of gold, silver, food, siege engines and weapons were found in the city. 8,000 surviving citizens were allowed to leave with their families. 2,000 slaves were offered to work for Rome with the promise of freedom in the future. Ship crews and merchants were recruited into the Roman navy. The high-ranking Carthaginians, including Mago, were kept as prisoners. While dividing the spoils, a dispute arose between two soldiers. A centurion, Quintus Trebellius, and a marine, Sextus Digitius, both claimed they were the first to scale the walls. Supported by their officers and their fellow soldiers, the dispute was about to boil over. Stepping in, Scipio thoroughly examined the evidence and after a lengthy debate, decided to honor both men by awarding each the golden crown. This act further increased the admiration the men held for their general. 300 Spanish hostages were freed from the city. They were treated well and returned to their families. Scipio would use them as leverage to secure alliances with Spanish tribes. Among these prisoners was a particularly beautiful young woman, whom the men offered to their leader as a great prize. He reluctantly refused them and returned the girl to her father. This event would be romanticized throughout history, further elevating the myth of the great general. The fall of Carthago Nova was a heavy hit to the Carthaginians, both politically, as it had been the seat of their power ever since it was established by Hasdrubal the Fair 18 years earlier, but also militarily. Resources and prisoners captured in the city would be used with great effect by the young Scipio. However, 3 large Punic armies still roamed freely across Iberia, and the fate of the peninsula was yet to be decided on the field of battle. Laelius sailed off to Rome, carrying the news and valuable prisoners, while Scipio spent the rest of the year rigorously training his armies in New Carthage. From what we can gather, the Punic generals were not in contact with each other, and none of them made a move against Scipio. Leaving a strong garrison in the city, Scipio returned to his winter quarters in Tarraco. There he hosted some Spanish chieftains who came to thank him for returning their families and to form new alliances. One of these chieftains was a man named Edeco, leader of the Edetani. After receiving his wife and kids, Edeco flattered Scipio by calling him a king. In early 208, Scipio was preparing for a campaign against one of the Punic armies. He drew in men from the navy to his legions, gathering some 30,000 troops. When he crossed the Ebro, he was intercepted by Indibilis, one of the closest allies of Carthage, and a man partly responsible for the death of his father. However, things had changed since late 211. Some of the prisoners in Carthago Nova were the wife and daughters of his brother Mandonius, and the chieftains broke off their alliance with the Punic generals. Now that Scipio had returned the prisoners, the brothers pledged loyalty to Rome and joined Scipio with 5,000 fresh troops. They too saluted Scipio as a king. It's clear that Hasdrubal's methods were not on par with his great predecessors, and the Barcid hold of Iberia was slowly shattering. Scipio continued his march deep inside enemy territory, meeting Hasdrubal Barca in the upper Betis valley near Baecula. When the Barcid general learned of the Roman approach, he didn't send word to his fellow generals, nor did he attempt to set a trap. Instead, he decided to wait for Scipio on open ground, setting up his camp on a well-defended hilltop. In all likelihood, Hasdrubal was reluctant to meet Scipio in battle, having made preparations to finally march to Italy. Scipio sent out his skirmishers, supported by heavy infantry, to ascend the hill. Hasdrubal's light troops slowly gave way, and he ordered the rest of his army to form up. Meanwhile, Scipio divided his main force in two, with him commanding the left wing and Laelius the right. They reached the summit before the Punic troops had a chance to form an effective battle line. Seeing no hope of stopping the Roman onslaught, Hasdrubal decided to retreat. According to Roman historians, Hasdrubal fled the field even before the battle had started. In the ensuing pursuit, as many as 12,000 Carthaginian troops were slain or captured. Hasdrubal and the remnants of his army escaped north across the Tagus. From there, they started a long and perilous march towards Italy. Lacking the strength to stop him, Scipio could only hope that the Italian forces would defeat this weakened army before they met up with Hannibal. In the aftermath of the battle, many tribes of the upper Betis valley came to congratulate Scipio. He was once more greeted as a king. As we are well aware, the Romans had an innate hatred for kings. If the Senate caught wind of these proclamations, Scipio could face serious trouble, and if he was seen encouraging them, his life would likely be forfeit. Instead, Scipio asked the Spaniards to simply call him general. If we are to believe Livy, he used the term Imperator, adding that the soldiers had already given him this title. If true, this would make Scipio Africanus the first Roman Imperator. At this time, the word simply meant commander, but later it would be used for victorious Roman generals and eventually emperors. There are no other records linking the title Imperator to Scipio. However, when his brother-in-law Lucius Aemilius Paulus was appointed governor of Spain in 189, he began using the title, perhaps in reference to this event. Following his victory, Scipio returned to Tarraco, where he would spend the rest of the year in relative calm. The Carthaginians sent a new general, Hanno, with some reinforcements to aid their forces in Iberia. He and Mago would march to central Iberia in order to recruit new fighters among the Celt-Iberian tribes. The following year, Lucius Scipio was sent to join his elder brother in Spain. While Publius stayed behind in Tarraco, he sent Silanus with 10,000 foot and 500 horse to try and stop further recruitment of the Celt-Iberians. Silanus marched in secret and surprised the Punic generals. While Mago managed to escape with his army, Hanno was captured before he had a chance to fight. With this victory under their belt, Scipio marched in full force towards Gades and the two Punic generals. Sensing the shift in the balance of power, most of the Spanish allies north of the Betis were now abandoning Carthage. Hasdrubal Gisco, unwilling to risk an open battle, dispersed his men among the garrisons of loyal cities. With the supply line stretched thin, Scipio was forced to return to Tarraco, where he spent the rest of the year. While 207 was uneventful in Spain, Hasdrubal Barca crossed the Alps in early spring and was moving south with great speed. We will, however, first finish the narrative in Spain before returning to Italy. During the winter, Hasdrubal Gisco gathered an immense force, numbering 70,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants according to Polybius, or 50,000 infantry and 4,500 cavalry according to Livy. With this large army, he marched to the town of Ilipa on the lower Betis. On the other side of Iberia, Scipio gathered 45,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Half of his army was comprised of allied Spanish tribes. Having made all necessary preparations, Scipio advanced to finally meet Hasdrubal Gisco in battle. As the Romans were setting up their camp opposite the Carthaginians, Mago led a sudden cavalry charge. Having anticipated such disruptions, Scipio concealed some of his cavalry behind one of the hills. As the Punic horsemen approached the camp, the concealed cavalry sprang into action and attacked the Carthaginians from the flank. Surprised, the Punic cavalry retreated back to safety, and the Romans were free to finish their camp in peace. Over the following days, as the two armies observed each other, the generals deployed in the usual manner. Hasdrubal placed his best heavy troops, the Libyans, in the center, his Spanish allies on the flanks, and cavalry and elephants in front of the battle line. Scipio did the same, with his heavy legions in the center, his Spanish allies on the wing, and cavalry in the front. When Scipio finally decided to offer battle, he ordered his men to rise before the first light and prepare for combat. Well rested and fed, they marched out of the camp. Scipio ordered his cavalry to charge the Punic line and draw them out. Suddenly woken up, the Carthaginians had no time to eat and had to march out with great haste. The Roman cavalry was ordered to prolong the skirmish with their counterparts as long as possible. Still tired, hungry, thirsty, and baking in the midday sun, the Punic forces waited desperately for the battle to begin. This tactic closely resembles Hannibal's methods at Trebia, where the hungry and freezing Romans faced well-prepared Carthaginians. Clear evidence that Scipio was studying his great rival from the very beginning. In this confusion, Hasdrubal failed to realize that Scipio had altered his formation. He placed the Spanish allies in the center, while the heavy legions were split between the two wings. Right commanded by himself and Lelius, and the left by Silanus and Lucius Marcius, an equestrian who saved the remnants of the army after the disasters at Upper Betis in 211. Scipio finally signaled his cavalry to fall back, and his infantry started a slow march towards the Punic line. The wings formed in two narrow columns and advanced ahead of the Spanish troops. Hasdrubal did nothing as he watched the Romans close in. When they reached the enemy line, the Romans threw missiles at the elephants and the cavalry, causing a stampede and forcing them away from the battlefield. They then wheeled around and engaged the Spanish flanks. Eventually, they were joined by their Spanish allies, who engaged the Libyan center. Under the immense pressure from the heavy legions, the Punic flanks gave way. What started as a slow, controlled retreat turned into a complete rout. An outbreak of a sudden thunderstorm saved the Carthaginians from certain doom. The next day, the Spanish allies abandoned Hasdrubal, and seeing the writing on the wall, he ordered a full retreat. They were pursued by the Romans, and only around 6,000 men managed to reach a mountain top where they were encircled. Realizing there was no hope of saving their men, Hasdrubal and Mago made a hasty escape, leaving their men stranded. Hasdrubal Gisco sailed to Africa, while Mago fled first to Gades and then to the Balearic Islands, where he hoped to recruit more fresh troops for the Italian campaign. Leaderless, the last remnants of the Carthaginian army in Spain disbanded and surrendered to the Romans. In just 4 short years, Scipio ended the 400 years of Carthaginian presence in Iberia. The Spanish tribes in southern Iberia now flocked to the Roman side, and the era of Roman Hispania began. It would take the Romans almost 200 years to finally complete the conquest of the peninsula. In the Battle of Ilipa, Scipio took a huge risk by splitting his line. A skilled general like Hannibal could have easily exploited this self-inflicted weakness and punished his enemy. However, Hasdrubal Gisco was no great general, and on that day luck favored the bold Scipio Africanus. Roman troops displayed a higher level of discipline than anything present at the start of the war. The long years of campaigning in Italy, Spain, and Sicily had made the Roman legions an unstoppable force we know today. In contrast to the olden days, the legions remained deployed for years at a time, allowing commanders to drill them into the best fighting force in the Mediterranean. It would now only take a handful of competent generals for the Romans to conquer the known world. The loyalties of the Spanish tribes were tied to the great generals personally, rather than to nation-states as a whole. When Scipio then fell ill and a rumor of his death spread across the peninsula, some of these tribes rebelled against Rome. Indibilis, seeing an opportunity, called upon other Iberian and Celta-Iberian chieftains and launched a raid into Roman territory. When Scipio finally recovered, he gathered an army and crushed the Spaniards. Indibilis managed to escape, but he would be killed only a year later when he rose up again. Having secured Iberia, Scipio sailed to Africa to the court of the Numidian king Syphax. He hoped to rekindle all ties his father had previously made with the Numidians. To his surprise, Hasdrubal Gisco and his officers were already at the court of the Numidian king. Syphax found this very amusing, and he prepared a banquet for the two generals. It is said that Scipio secured favorable terms with the king. However, they would not bear fruit. Syphax would ultimately turn to Carthage. Back in Iberia, the other Numidian king, Massinissa, a staunch ally of the Barcids, was disillusioned with the new leadership. Seeing the Punic commanders had abandoned their men, Massinissa contacted the Romans in secret. He was allowed to freely return to Africa, leaving on friendly terms with Scipio. He would still have a crucial role to play before this war came to an end. While campaigning in Spain, Scipio realized that the only way to end the war was an invasion of Africa. Ever since Sempronius abandoned his preparations in early 218, The idea of mounting an invasion was out of the realm of possibilities. Now, however, with the conquest of Spain, the Carthaginian source of power and wealth was eliminated, and several veteran legions were freed up. Leaving Silanus and Lucius Manlius in charge of Iberia, Scipio returned to Rome at the end of 206. There he would prepare for his magnum opus, invasion of Africa and the final defeat of Hannibal Barca. But before we can follow him south, we first need to return to Hasdrubal's invasion of Italy. Join us next time as we discuss the end of Hannibal's Italian campaign. Publius Licinius Crassus, serving as Pontifex Maximus, saw no problem with Hannibal's appointment.